Welcome back to Gaming Bench. Today we're looking at Frostpunk 2, a strategy game that's set in a 3D top-down view. It uses Unreal Engine, and like so many games with Unreal Engine, it tends to have quite a bit of stutter at times, and that's especially true with Frostpunk 2. Benchmarking it is also a little difficult because there's constant pop-ups and alerts trying to get your attention, so I opted for a relatively simplistic benchmark where I'm just going to spin in a circle around the central city of New London and see how things perform. I run that about 3 times, and there's a lot of hitching the first time, but once the game loads most of the assets, it calms down. I'm not going to show videos of the benchmark sequence because it's not really useful to look at. It's just a quick and dirty way of seeing how well the game runs, because I will be honest, the game runs like a frozen pig. We'll start with 1080p medium. We're going to run at native resolution so there's no upscaling or frame generation, and we've got 9 graphics cards to talk about. You'll see here at the top, the RX 7900 XTX takes first place, followed by the 4090, the 4080 Super, and then the 7900 GRE. There's a relatively decent gap between the GRE and the RTX 4070, and then another drop down to the 7600 XT at 73 frames per second, the 4060 at 63 frames per second, and anything below that level couldn't even average 60 frames per second. That's not like the end of the world because this isn't a fast-paced Twitch game, but it is worth mentioning. Once we kick up to Ultra settings, the standings change quite a bit. Now the 4090 rises to the top, still averaging 100 frames per second. The XTX and the 4080 Super are basically tied, with AMD having a slight lead. The 7900 GRE still beats the RTX 4070 by about 20% almost, and that's not too unusual because it usually is faster in rasterization games. AMD's 7600 XT also beats the RTX 4060 by a couple of frames per second, and then when we get to the true budget cards, the 6600 and 3050 are both struggling to maintain a playable frame rate at 1080p Ultra. Now you can turn on DLSS upscaling or FSR upscaling, and if you use FSR you can also do frame generation, but I will say frame generation FSR style in this game doesn't seem to work well. It doesn't improve the minimums, so there's almost constant hitching as you get higher average frames per second, but a worse overall experience almost. We'll look at that in more detail at 4K. Kicking up to 1440p, we may as well just drop the 3050 from the testing, and the 6600 could have gotten the axe as well. The 4090 is the only card that's consistently getting about 60 frames per second or higher, followed by the 7900 XTX, which does average 60 but does dip below that on a regular basis, and then just behind that is the 4080 Super. AMD's 7900 GRE continues to offer much better performance than the RTX 4070, and the same goes for the 7600 XT beating the 4060. This is a case where I think maybe the extra VRAM is helping the AMD card, but it's tough to say because the 6600 at 12 frames per second, like that's not playable, but it doesn't look like it's totally run out of memory. It just doesn't have the compute necessary to run at 1440p Ultra. We're going to drop most of the cards from the list when we kick up to 4K Ultra. Even the 4070 wasn't doing so hot, and so I didn't bother testing that. In fact, even the 4090 is just barely breaking 30 frames per second, and the 7900 XT is a bit worse than that. They're kind of playable because it's not a fast-paced game again, but not a great experience. 4080 Super, 7900 GRE, they're basically tied, which is pretty remarkable considering the level of hardware we're talking about. You've got a $550 card from AMD taking on a $1,000 card from Nvidia and offering almost equivalent performance. And then at the bottom, that 7600 XT, the less we say about that, the better. Now, you can't run native very well, so let's see what upscaling and frame gen can do for you. And frame generation seems like this is a perfect case for it because a little bit of latency isn't going to be the end of the world in a strategy game. The problem is, as you can see by the FSR 3 results, both on the top Nvidia cards as well as on the AMD cards, is that the minimums are really quite poor still. So DLSS 3 frame generation on the 4090 and the 4080 Super and even the 4070 it feels way smoother and way better and looks better than FSR3 frame generation in this case. So even though the 4090 with FSR3 got 101 frames per second compared to 97 frames per second, look at that 1% low value. 81 for DLSS 3 frame generation, 42 for FSR3. The 7900 XTX isn't much better, 34 frames per second on the minimums. 4080 Super got 32 frames per second with FSR3 compared to 67 with DLSS frame gen. So this is a game where if you're going to use frame gen, it looks like DLSS 3 is the way to go, which means you have to have a 40 series card. Anyway, that's it. Like I said, it's a quick and dirty benchmark. I don't want to waste a lot of time showing gameplay with interruptions and other stuff going on. You can certainly play this game at 30 frames per second and it will run okay. But if you want like a smooth experience, well, you're probably not going to get it regardless because there's a lot of loading and hitching that happens that my benchmark didn't really show because I wasn't doing a really lengthy play session. But like I said, you can play the game. It's kind of fun and it's pretty cool. I like the atmosphere and all of that, but the performance is quite stuttery at times and that's unfortunate. You'll need a pretty beefy graphics card to run this one well. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.